I have built a ton of robots on this channel, from this Wall-E model of my early YouTube days to this X2 unit, an original automecha design from my own universe. Over time, the size and complexity of my builds has increased, so I wanted to challenge myself to kitbash 3 small construction bots. This project would quickly become a whirlwind of concept art, industrial design, and scratch building that I learned so much from. And now it's time to share that journey with you. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. For those of you new to the channel, Beyond the Blight is a long-term world-building project, combining model making with original sci-fi short stories, which I write and narrate. Today's build is taken from the Ekrite Dominion, Aegis' northeastern region. This specific area is called the Dross Ring, which will be familiar to those of you who've read my recent novel. When conceptualizing new builds, I usually plan out as many details and try to solve as many problems as I can. While this helps to speed up the building process, it's also somewhat constraining and stressful, and after my last mammoth project, I needed a palette cleanser. So I kept things quick and loose and explored whatever shapes came to mind, rather than basing the designs off of objects I had on hand. I also used this opportunity to practice drawing various types of mechanical joints, with the goal of better understanding these complex forms and how they moved. After I'd done a bunch of rough sketches, I decided that for this project, instead of coming up with specific designs, I would create an entire library of visual references to draw from, mixing and matching elements as I went. This really freed me up to be as creative and inventive as possible here, not worrying if a design looked too silly or unrealistic. Still, I spent a lot of time thinking about what each of these bots might be used for, and referencing things like generators, propane tanks, winches, and security cameras helped to inform these decisions. I had so much fun with this process that I ended up filling this entire poster paper with designs, and once the pen work was done, I used alcohol markers to add some simple shading. When everything was finished, I ended up with some really interesting concepts, and I was excited to start building. I settled on this design as the basis for the first bot, and quickly sketched up a template with some measurements. I wanted the frame to be nice and sturdy, so I used .060 styrene. After marking the measurements and scoring with a brand new super sharp X-Acto blade, I snapped the styrene apart, then added my cross measurements and cuts. To add little connector ports on the front face, I first nicked holes with the tip of my blade, then expanded on these with a drill. I filed down the rough edges, and then it was time to break out the styrene scraps. For the last few months, I've been purchasing odd lots of these tubes and rods from places like eBay and AliExpress. Often you can buy assorted packs for just a few dollars, and I've included some of these links in the video's description. To get these little bits to fit snugly in the portholes I drilled, I added just a bit of masking tape to the sides, then inserted and glued. I then carefully snapped this front face along the scored line, then moved on to the interior. Weld-On 3 was used to fuse the front face with the interior spine, and once that had set, it was time to add detail. While I had originally had a portable generator in mind as the inspiration for this bot's design, I eventually started referencing car engines, including my own. I then got some parts from my bits bins to dry fit things together and explore options. This is where having a clear system of organization is super nice. What wasn't so nice was trying to cut this 3D printed bit I received for a collaboration a couple of years ago. To even out this terribly uneven cut, I used green stuff, then glued it into the interior, then added a small bead for inserting a cable later on. To really give the interior the look of a complex chassis with multiple layers, I used this model kit piece to raise this section by a bit, then added these other kit pieces. I next made a cable from Anakin's Pod Racer kit.
What? With this?
To get the right curve, I first warmed it up with my heat gun, then bent it into the desired shape. This process continued with other odds and ends, fitting things where they seemed to make sense, and in other cases, trimming parts down and patching them up for a better footprint. Tiny lengths of Q-tip rods created these pipe sockets, and heated and bent bits of acrylic rods made for excellent pipes to insert. I then trimmed down this toy radiator with a jeweler's saw and added that into the mix. And to give this pipe some extra detail, I added little lengths of heat shrink tubing. There was something very satisfying about seeing all these random pieces come together so cohesively, and I did my best to make it all seem as intentional and as functional as possible, from the way wires were bundled and snaked around the machinery to how everything appeared to be connected to some sort of power source. The hardest piece of all of this was the final pipe, which I wanted to connect to the end of the radiator to round out the back of the design. But after lots of fiddling and melting with the heat gun, I finally achieved this. Finally, to create this corner panel seen in the concept art, I went back to 060 styrene and quickly measured and cut this piece, then added some details with a scoring tool. I sanded the edges to round them slightly to match the rest of the hull, and then it was on to the other side, which would end up being a much bigger headache. I don't know what possessed me to attempt a functioning, articulated crane arm, but once I had the idea in my head, I simply couldn't resist it. I think I assumed that since I already had so many Gundam kit joints, it would be fairly simple, but that turned out to be very, very wrong. I started from the claw end of the arm, cutting this styrene rod, which was easy enough. But since I wanted the arm to be articulated, in other words, able to move, I had to drill very precise holes on either side of the rod so that this piece could swivel. Then came this step, which brought me a sense of rage and frustration that I haven't felt since before the days of Bluetooth headphones. Even more irritating, it seems that the manufacturers of brass rods, styrene rods, and Gundam kits are all kind of doing their own thing, because they never quite nested properly in one another, forcing me to do these kinds of ridiculous modifications. But in the end, I think it was all worth it for this smooth, swiveling joint, and I only had to do like 4 more. Now, because I had it in my mind that using Gundam hinges would be preferable to making my own, I had to narrow the joint so that the pieces would fit. This meant getting little bits of styrene, and surprise, they didn't want to stick for some reason. Another thing that made this excruciating is that I don't own a drill press, so making these perfectly vertical drill holes had me basically doing calisthenics at my workbench so that I could line it all up by eye. Now, you may be wondering at this point why I didn't just fire up Blender and 3D print these arms. The answer, surprisingly, is that this was actually the easier approach. Printing functional joints at this scale involves very precise measurements, but more importantly, it means using the right mixture of various resins so that there would be enough flex to snap the joints together. I knew that this would involve many batches of test prints and hours or even days spent waiting for the printer, cleaning the vat, and remixing batches of resin. In the end, I was able to complete this whole crane arm in an afternoon, and ended up doing most of it with my own custom-made hinges and joints. In model making, I've found that it's often the most challenging aspects that become the best learning experiences, and what I learned is I will never make an articulated crane arm again. Of course, although the thing was functional, the surface was a bit plain, so I took an overhead picture with a ruler next to it for reference, then designed some cover details in Adobe Animate, laser cut them from this cereal box, and glued them on with Mod Podge. While totally unnecessary, complex surfaces like these would give the paints and enamel washes more crevices and faces to detail, and were worth it in the end. In the original concept art, this bot had 4 legs, but I decided to go instead with a pair of treads. The undercarriage started with this bit of styrene, and after scratch building this square vent and attaching it to the black piece of plastic, and then adding this Gundam bit as a bumper, I made the wheel axles from these toy tank pieces fitted with styrene tubes. Acrylic rods ensured that the wheels would stay firmly in place, and once the excess was trimmed off, I bent and attached these styrene rods and glued it all together. Next was the rear panel of the bot. As usual, I did all of this design in Adobe Animate, a vector illustration program that I've been using for years, which I find a lot more intuitive than Illustrator. Since I needed this very fine mesh, I cut this all out on my laser cutter, then glued those pieces to this bit of 060 styrene. As usual, I used Mod Podge for gluing here to give myself just a bit of time to wiggle things perfectly into place. Unfortunately though, I did not account for the thickness of the chipboard, so I went back and re-glued the pieces to the outside of the back panel. The last piece was the roof panel, which I envisioned as some sort of hood that could flip open, although in the end it was glued down. So I made some custom hinges by cutting up a brass tube, then inserting and cutting a styrene tube of the same length. The middle section of brass was then glued to the front face of the bot, while the outer sections were glued to the roof. Some finishing touches were added to the crane side of the bot, and to soften these wires to get them to perfectly fit the contour of the edges, I used a heat gun, then carefully pressed them in place. Cut and halved Q-tip rods were used as mounting brackets, and then came the tank treads, which had to be trimmed down then carefully glued into place. For the bot's ocular, or glass lens, I went back to an old method used here, googly eyes. I carefully trimmed the plastic dome off, prepped a tank wheel as a base, then filled the dome with UV resin to give the glass some thickness. While still uncured, I then inset the tank wheel and added more resin to the back, then cured. Other model kits were used to encase the ocular, after which I attached everything to the bot's front face. This was a fun experiment, but it didn't really give me the effect I'd hoped for, so I decided to try something totally different for the next bot. I decided to base my second bot off of this guy. I liked his spidery body and the tiny torch on his underside, and the fact that his head sort of resembled an astromech droid from Star Wars made it feel like a nod to some of my earliest sci-fi inspiration. Fortunately, I keep a specific bin solely for cylindrical pieces, so I grabbed all the suitable ones and began dry fitting them together to match the shapes seen in the concept. After sanding down this spice bottle lid and gluing it to this other lid, I attached this bit from a Nerf gun's air pump. Next, after taking some measurements and doing some quick math, I cut this strip of styrene so that the sides of the head would be completely flat and even. Throughout this project, I bounced back and forth a lot between physical building, brainstorming, and digital design. I did some of this while out and about, such as while riding the train to and from work. And as I've learned from the tech-savvy people in my life, using public Wi-Fi can be super sketchy, which is where today's video partner, NordVPN, comes in. As my longtime viewers know, I'll only promote products that I actually use and can vouch for. And in a world where I'm constantly entering passwords and accessing sensitive information while on the go, VPNs are becoming more and more important. NordVPN encrypts your personal data when using public networks, and it also has some nice features like threat protection and dark web monitor, which will alert you to suspicious sites you may be fooled into accessing or let you know if your data is being sold illegally. To try it out for yourself, visit nordvpn.com/gameybuilds for an exclusive NordVPN offer. All 2-year plans come with a 4-month bonus, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied or you find you're just not using it that much. This is currently the best deal for NordVPN, so feel free to check it out if you're interested. With the head finished for now, I moved on to the bot's body, which is based on this cross-section from a pen. After carefully drilling 4 holes, I jammed in these socket joints. I decided to make the switch from 3 legs to 4 for the sake of realism. While a tripod design would be much more stable when standing still, the 3 legs doesn't make for a very good walking design unless you're trying to kill Tom Cruise in War of the Worlds. Once some extra panel detailing had been added with styrene, I slapped on a bit of green stuff so that the head would fit snugly onto the torso. To make the leg segments match the concept design, these pieces were too long, so I trimmed them down and then added curved ends with my Dremel. I then designed and cut some styrene covers for the leg segments and glued. Additional panel designs were attached, and then a bead was added to the curved end to act as a hinge. The next segment of the legs was made from several stacked layers of styrene, though I left a tiny hollow chamber inside so that a metal wire could be installed and then inserted into the bead. This meant there would be no chance the legs would snap off later. It all came together in the end, especially after adding yet more chipboard panels. And with this aesthetic clearly established, I could go back to the head and design a circular panel with a little cut hole so that I could attach this model kit hatch. Next came the bot's feet, which again had to include a tiny hollow channel for the leg wire. Green stuff helped keep everything nice and snug, and once the feet were finished, it was also used to create these tiny rubber joint covers. To beef up the look of the bot just a little bit, I also created these leg fenders from styrene. And yes, these panels were cut from one of my printed bookmarks and actually ended up being a real nightmare during the painting stage. At this point though, everything was looking great, and it was just a matter of a bit more detailing here and there to create a consistent appearance so that it looked like something that stepped off a manufacturing line and not from under Sid's bed. I did, however, make a really stupid decision here in trying to fill the gaps between these covers and the body. I thought I could create a smoother surface by adding strips of green stuff, but the space was so awkward and difficult to sculpt and sand, and in the end I hid some of the ugliness behind yet more styrene, but I really wish I'd just left well enough alone. In any case, it was on to the little welding torch at the bottom, which was made from a misprinted piece I originally designed years ago for my prison tram scene here. After a bit of styrene tubing and electrical wire was added, it was good to go. The final steps included attaching these fins to the tops of the legs, trimming down the neck joint by a few millimeters to better match the concept, adding this antenna and then all these head details, and before I knew it, it was time to make another ocular. This time I had an idea for a brand new technique that came out awesome, but that would come after painting, so stay tuned. For the third and final bot, I decided to go with a combination of some of my favorite elements from the concepts. This cube-shaped body, these cool graded cargo shelves, and this spool wire rack. A couple of years ago, I got this tiny LED screen for another project, and fortunately I never threw the plastic housing away. It did, however, see some serious modification. As per usual, it was super hard getting even symmetrical cuts doing this by hand, so if you have any suggestions on how I can improve in the future without a scary electrical saw, let me know in the comments. Once this interior panel was added for the face and some styrene was glued to the front for panels, I drilled a couple of eye holes to line up with this model kit piece, which I believe came from an ATST. For the cargo shelves, I first cut up these trusses, sanded down the rough edges, then carefully chopped away the unwanted bits with a flat X-Acto. I then scanned these pieces next to a ruler to get the precise measurements that I'd need to design the wire mesh. At the same time, I designed and printed these side panels, which would serve as the basis for the color scheme later on. You'll notice too that I included these 6 tiny holes in the panels, and that was done to serve as a guide for some structural supports, made from paper clips. Once the wires were glued and the excess trimmed, they served as strong internal supports for these short lengths of hollow styrene tubes, which I cut at exact lengths with the help of this simple jig in my miter box. In the past, I probably wouldn't have added supports for these rods, but they really helped to keep everything perpendicular to the hull and added so much strength to the shelves. Since these needed to be able to hold cargo, that was a good call. And since I wanted the cargo to be able to slide in and out, I needed cross beams, which were also made from styrene tubes. Next, for the spool rack, I used these ATST leg bits and this part from a tank model along with some more styrene. Off camera, I also glued on these side racks, which actually move. I then made the spools themselves from tank wheels while discovering a brand new way to burn my fingers. For the spool sides, I glued on these bits of chipboard, which didn't give me a lot of space for the actual wire, but since you'd only see the outer layer of wire anyway, that wasn't too important. The spool wire was made from electrical wire and fit perfectly on the side racks. The main spool was made from a styrene tube, and this time, the wire came from some old headphones that I'd taken apart at the start of this project, but hadn't yet used. I then got working on the legs, starting with this styrene sandwiched between 2 tank wheels. This was attached to this plastic bit that may be from a Gundam, but I'm not too sure. I chose it for its shape, but also the tiny hole inside, which allowed me to attach this styrene tube and a swiveling knee joint, although I did come back later and reinforce this with a thicker styrene tube for an outer layer. To make sure the head swiveled freely but snugly, I drilled a hole here and added a bit of styrene to perfectly fit this model kit piece, which would serve as the hips. A styrene rod ensured that the legs would attach firmly to the hips while still being able to rotate, and it all looked and functioned pretty well, so I moved on to the calves. Then came the ankles and feet, also taken from the modded bot pieces that lent their ball joints to the previous bot's legs. Fearing the feet were too small, I drilled some holes in the toes and added some electrical wire and then styrene, and green stuff was squeezed in to keep it all together. Because the top of the bot looked a little too bare at this point, I added one final cargo rack to the roof, using the same pieces that had given me the side shelves earlier. As before, I made sure it all attached securely by drilling holes and adding wires and styrene as crossbars. For the cargo, I jotted down all of the various shelves' measurements and opened Blender to design everything for 3D printing. While I technically could have scratch-built these from styrene, I opted for 3D printing here and only here because it made sense to design containers that might be reused in future builds. My original idea for the bases was to use these wood cubes, but eventually I settled on flat, circular bases, which I thought would be more stable. These were laser cut from pine wood, and it took 3 layers to get the thickness I needed. Because I wanted these bots to be trundling over the rubble of some ruined structure, I needed to make lots of debris, so it was right back to styrene scratch building, starting with these pipes. After I had made a couple of joints, I sanded a round end in another tube for a flush T-joint. For this corrugated pipe, I found that a bendy straw made for difficult smooth curves until this telephone cable was inserted. And while I had some leftover styrofoam bricks, they seemed too small for the scale of my bots, so I broke out the wire cutter table and trimmed up some new ones out of XPS foam. After some texturing, this was the result. Finally, to make some bent and mangled pipes, I roughly cut these styrene tubes, then used my heat gun to soften the edges. For ground cover, a texture paste was made with 2 grits of sand for texture, brown paint, water, Mod Podge, and plaster. By the way, the reason I color this plaster, even though it'll be painted later, is that it tends to chip and dent after drying, and if that happened, I wanted whatever was exposed to not be white. After lathering on this satisfyingly goopy paste, I added the pipes while it was still wet, then the other details like bricks, broken plaster chips from previous projects, gravel, and wire. After brushing on a bit more mud to the surfaces of things, I decided which bot would go with which base and added footprints for the supply bot. I then dipped on some watered down Mod Podge to lock everything in place, and once it all dried, I trimmed away the excess pipes. And after a month of building, it was on to painting. But before I narrate my latest short story in the Beyond the Blight anthology, I'm thrilled to announce a brand new batch of stuff in my online shop. Now, if you were one of the viewers who thought the BallBot Noodle Shop would make for a great t-shirt design, you'll be happy to know that I finally made it happen. This vibrant 6-color design came out beautifully, and if t-shirts aren't your thing, it's also available as a high-quality poster, a sticker, and even an embroidered patch, great for backpacks and jackets. And if you like the bots from this video, you might enjoy these blank notebooks, a first ever for my shop. I also have some brand new sticker sheets with 9 separate stickers, and of course, a poster of all the bots from my concept art. Check it out while supplies last at gameybuilds.com.
It had been 7 years, 4 months, and 12 days since he'd lost her, though he hadn't accepted it right away. Even as he stood by the wreckage of her crumbling hotel, his face stinging with the heat of a fire that could not possibly conceal a survivor, a heat that lasted for weeks after the final flames were extinguished, he could not accept that his dear Saina was gone. Since his talk with his daughter the previous night, Viterklava could think of nothing but seeing his dead wife. The idea that somehow the pseudomine had collected and stored enough user information to bring someone back in simulated form was tantalizing. Whatever misgivings he had about the privacy violations such data scraping had required, he was willing to set aside if only it meant seeing her again. He'd hardly slept at all that night, and his mind was still racing early the next morning when he made the 80-kilometer commute to the quarry.
"What's gotten into you?"
he heard his friend grumble at him over the clattering wheels of the rail car. It was Parney, crystal blue eyes gleaming with their usual mischief from beneath the brim of his mining hat.
"Hope he's not sober," said someone else. "I've never seen him in that state, and I'm not sure I'd trust him on the drill if he was dry."
Unger laughed. He was Parney's brother-in-law, though they could have passed for twins in the low cabin lights, especially in their matching hats and soot-stained work uniforms.
"Do either of you know much about the risers?" Vider asked.
"You mean the sim station?" Parney replied.
Vider nodded. "Know it," Unger said. "Mila practically banned Parney from ever returning after he blew a week's pay on a bad sparring bet."
"He should have won that fight," Parney said bitterly. "Match was rigged. Only explanation."
"Besides the gaming floors," Vider prodded, a little impatiently. "Besides the gaming? Betting's all we go for, Vider. There's real money to be won in that place, don't you know?" said Unger. "Yes, and I've heard they pay wages to the users for completing missions, I believe they're called," Vider said, remembering this detail from his conversation with his daughter.
"Aye, I've heard that as well," Parney said, rubbing his chin.
"And my boy was gifted a token when the riser by our block was still under construction. That's his story, anyway, though the kid's too scrawny to have beaten anyone for it, so I suppose I believe him. He gets in for free. Imagine that."
"For you too," Vider exclaimed. He felt utterly mystified. Nothing in the Dross Ring was free, especially in such a lavish facility.
"How do you suppose they manage it, giving away all these tokens for entry? There's no money in freebies."
"Gambling's an addiction, and everyone knows it," a fourth voice chimed in. Officious as always, Limrit, sitting one bench behind them, tilted his nose high into the air, giving him just a bit more elevation from which to sneer down at them. "They're luring the youths in to hook them early. They'll end up losing more on the gaming floors than the cost of entry, I'll tell you that much. It's a clever scheme, but a scheme all the same."
"I don't think so," Vider countered. "My Foria's been earning a steady wage. Our account's looking better than it did when she was combing scrap or running errands for the rip shops." "Well, I know who's buying us all around after work," Unger guffawed. "Do any of you know who's building these risers? Whole structures shooting from the ground overnight. Working there might be better employment than the quarry. And certainly closer," Vider said, ignoring him.
"Don't bother," Limrit announced. "Everything is automated. Walkers and automecha all the way around, from the laying of the foundations to installing the simulation pods. No human hands whatsoever."
"Hope they're not coming for our jobs next," Unger grumbled. But Vider was wondering about something else. "All machines, you say? Well, then you'd need workers to repair them, to maintain them. That's an industry right there."
"Wrong again," Limrit said, clearly pleased to be the one with the answers. "They've got mecha for that too."
"Bots repairing bots. Crannin', what's this world coming to?" Parney lamented.
"What else do you know about the place?" Vider asked Limrit. The man looked stunned. He was used to badgering others with his knowledge. Being sought out for it was quite the foreign experience. "Well, what do you want to know exactly?" Getting up from his bench, Vider left Parney and Unger behind, who were now locking horns over some conversation about an old debt. He went and sat beside Limrit, and when he next spoke, his voice was hushed, his tone secretive. "My daughter's been spending a lot of time in the Sims. She said they've got a way to bring back old memories, let you relive them. I can't quite say I understand it. I never took to the consoles. Still, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued." Limrit nodded slowly, then pinched his spectacles from his face to wipe the lenses on a handkerchief. "There are many worlds in the realm. I can't say anything would surprise me. Still, you're right to be skeptical. All those machines zipping to and fro, no one knows exactly where they come from. They bear insignias from many different companies, and when their task is complete, they disappear just as quickly. It would be a logistical nightmare to coordinate something like that, and yet you never see them bumping into one another or sitting idly. Clearly something larger is at work. It's quite astonishing, really." "So,
You think the riser's safe? Biter pressed.
Safe? Of course. Mecha are far more thorough than human contractors, and they never cut corners to rush a job. I'm not a betting man, but I'd wager a good portion of my salary that those risers will still be standing long after our flats are in ruins.
And Limrit had no idea how right he was. Thank you all so much for watching. I had so much fun building these guys that I'm considering doing more one day, so let me know what you'd like to see in a future episode of Mini Bot Building. And until next time, this is Gamey Builds. Over and out.